Howdy viewers, my name is Henry, and this is Wild West Film School. In today's episode, we're covering Django Unchained. Written and directed by Quentin Tarantino, Django Unchained was released Christmas of 2012 by Columbia Pictures and... A
verdict reached in the closely watched trial of Harvey Weinstein, the once powerful Hollywood producer who was charged with 5 felony counts of predatory criminal sexual assault and rape.
The film is a homage to the spaghetti westerns of Sergio Corbucci and a spiritual successor to his 1966 cult classic, Django. Jamie Foxx stars as the titular slave-turned-gunslinger, who joins forces with German bounty hunter Dr. King Schultz, played by Christoph Waltz, on a crusade of justice and revenge to save his enslaved wife from the hands of a notorious plantation owner, Monsieur Calvin Candide, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. The idea for Django Unchained came to Tarantino when he was working on a subtextual film criticism book analyzing the westerns of Sergio Corbucci. He felt that Corbucci's bleak, surreal, and violent take on the Wild West was influenced by the fascist tyranny he'd experienced growing up in Italy. Tarantino thought to himself, what would be the American equivalent of living through such an institutional evil? Well, it'd be the experience of a slave in the antebellum South. Tarantino felt that films that had addressed slavery were, as he puts it, historical with a capital H, meaning they tended to be these prestige period dramas that, sure, did well at awards season, but failed to grab general audiences. Tarantino saw the opportunity to tell an entertaining and empowering Western adventure with slavery as the backdrop, providing a more accessible lens to which the American public could address the country's greatest sin. It's an admirable idea, though this take has not been without criticism. The film's opening credits showcase slaves being transported on a chain gang, accompanied with Louis Bakalov's original 1966 Django theme. Right off the bat, an argument could, and has been made, that this is out of touch and inappropriate, having a campy Western theme song play alongside the visual of enslaved human beings being herded like cattle, suffering in the cold with bare feet and whipped backs. You could say this juxtaposition is intentional, but the question remains, is a white filmmaker within his right to make that decision? And that's just the opening scene. The film has also obviously received criticism for its rampant use of the N-word, but also its dubious historical accuracy in the portrayal of Mandingo Fighting. I promise I do love this movie, and I know you're all here for Wild West Film School, not Race Theory Film School, but this is something that has to be addressed with a film as laser-focused on race as Django Unchained is. Tarantino is a white guy taking slavery, and while absolutely condemning it, still turning it into a spectacle. And while I don't doubt he's well-intentioned, in fact I know he is, it's important that we acknowledge that fact. So, is Tarantino secretly a racist? No, I wouldn't go that far, as it's more complicated than that. It's very apparent that Tarantino is obsessed with black people and black culture and has been for a long time. He recounts stories of how as a child his mom would always date black guys and they'd take him out to see blaxploitation films and he just thought they were so cool. I think because of stuff like this, Tarantino feels like he understands black people, which is obviously nonsense.
Steven Spielberg doesn't want to be black. Quentin Tarantino thinks he is.
And when he talks about how he made Django Unchained because black people need to grow up in a world where this film exists, it reeks of self-importance. Like I said, Tarantino is clearly well-intentioned, but a bit out of touch, and I as a fellow white guy am no better. But of course, while Django Unchained has many critics, there are just as many who found the film empowering. I, for one, aim to look at it as a Western, and will analyze it as such. With that being said, as a Western, Django Unchained kicks ass. The performances are incredible, the soundtrack bangs, the production design and scenery are stunning and immersive. Tarantino's writing and direction, as always, is stylish and engaging, but most importantly, the story here is sincere and satisfying. I care about these characters and what happens to them. I want more than anything for Django to save his woman and bring justice to her oppressors. Having to act alongside scene-stealing performers like Christoph Waltz, DiCaprio, and Sam Jackson, Jamie Foxx doesn't get nearly enough credit for his performance. The transition from timid, illiterate slave to confident Western hero is conveyed expertly through his delivery and body language. It's also just satisfying narratively. Like, realistically, it makes no sense for Django to be a sharpshooter the first time he picks up a rifle, but you don't care, because it's fun, and Schultz's line,
"The kid's a natural,"
gets you excited about the gunslinging action to come. I can't remember the last time I've been so invested in the protagonist of a Western. Naturally, there's the inherent sympathy that comes from the fact that he was a slave, but I think a lot of my investment in Django comes from just how well Fox plays the love that he has for his wife Broomhilda. Whether it's his helpless desperation when pleading to the Brittle brothers to spare her from being whipped, to his more subdued longing when talking about her with Schultz, you buy that Django is wholeheartedly in love and would go through hell and back to save his woman. Kerry Washington is just as amazing as Broomhilda. Obviously, that whipping sequence is gut-wrenching, but what really gets me is the moment where they're trying to escape and her and Django realize they're gonna get caught, so she kisses him one last time, and it's just so heartbreaking. When they finally do end up together in the end, calling it cathartic would be an understatement. Then there's Christoph Waltz, who's excellent as the gentleman bounty hunter Dr. King Schultz. This performance earned him his second Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, even though he's basically the film's co-lead, which is where another common criticism of Django Unchained arises, that being that Schultz steals the show and Django doesn't have much agency for a substantial chunk of the film. And I have to disagree. While it's clear that coming off Inglourious Basterds, Tarantino wrote in this German character to suit Waltz's scenery-chewing charm and eloquence, he never feels like he's the intended protagonist. Schultz is the mentor, providing Django the necessary skills to thrive with his newfound freedom, and in his death, passing the torch that allows Django to really come into his own as the film's hero. I do have my issues with his death scene, but we'll get to that later. What's important is that while he is around, Schultz is a joy to watch, and the character's wit and intellect provide the film with not only some of its best lines, but also its most biting commentary.
Alexandre Dumas, he wrote The Three Musketeers. I figured you must be an admirer. You named your slave after his novel's lead character. If Alexandre Dumas had been there today, I wonder what he would have made of it.
You doubt he'd approve, huh? Soft-hearted Frenchie.
Alexandre Dumas is black.
He's a very admirable character in a film chock full of despicable white people. But with that I ask, is Schultz as morally virtuous as he appears? Setting aside the fact that he kills people for a living, I'm more interested in the ethics of his relationship to Django. Remember, Schultz starts off the film by buying Django as a slave. Granted, he acknowledges that he feels guilty doing so, but that still doesn't stop him. Django is a means to an end, and as Schultz says, if Django isn't in any position to refuse, all the better. The real turning point in this quote-unquote partnership is when Django tells Schultz about Brunhilde, and he recognizes the parallels of Django's story to an old German legend. Here, Schultz realizes that he's part of something bigger than himself, and perhaps feeling guilty about exploiting Django, decides to aid him on his quest to save Brunhilde. Okay, let's backtrack a bit, because I want to talk about the whole plantation sequence before this. So, as I said, Schultz initially bought Django, because Django could identify the bounty targets he was hunting, the Brittle brothers, who worked as overseers on the Karukan plantation where Django and Brunhilde were enslaved. In fact, it was these very brothers who whipped Brunhilde when they were caught escaping. So, while yes, Django doesn't really have a choice in the matter of helping Schultz, it isn't something that he has a problem with either.
I like the way you beg, boy.
The Brittle brothers now go by the name of Schaefer, working as overseers for the plantation owner Big Daddy, played by Don Johnson. This character is fucking hysterical. Like, don't get me wrong, he's a monster and slave owner, but Tarantino goes out of his way to portray Big Daddy and the entirety of this backward southern aristocracy as nothing more than a bunch of bumbling buffoons. From the proto-clan lynch mob,
I can't see fucking shit out of this thing,
to a French-obsessed pseudo-intellectual like Candy, the villains in Django Unchained have nothing redeeming about them, which is a departure from Tarantino's previous portrayal of the Nazis in Inglourious Basterds as slick, intelligent, and dangerous. I really like how Big Daddy's attitude to Schultz and Django changes after Schultz offers him $5,000. It's a little insight into the strategy of him getting it in by making a ridiculous offer that they'll use later when dealing with Candy. Schultz buys his time with Big Daddy as Django scopes out the plantation for the Brittle brothers, who he finds out are whipping a girl. Django confronts them in one of the film's standout sequences. I even ripped this scene off in a Western short film I made when I was 16. Louis Bakalov's score blares triumphantly as the camera pushes in on a totally dripped out and pissed off Django, who calls back to the earlier whipping scene with this stone-cold line.
I like the way you die, boy.
Then we have one of the film's most iconic visuals, Django whipping the slaver, Tarantino's response to the cliché in media of black people always responding to racism with pacifism. Here Tarantino says, fuck that, they had it coming. Also, this whole exchange with Schultz is a lot of fun. Classic Tarantino writing.
Sure that's him?
Yeah,
Positive?
I don't know.
You don't know if you're positive?
I don't know what positive means.
It means you're sure.
Yes.
Yes what?
Yes, I'm sure that's Ellis Brittle. I'm positive he did.
Okay, now back to Schultz and Django's discussion about the German legend. Schultz tells Django the story of Brunhilde, a princess locked away in a tower guarded by a fire-breathing dragon, who's rescued by the brave hero Siegfried, who loves her. Obviously, this parallels Django and Brunhilde, and after recognizing that, Schultz is inspired to assist Django in saving her. But first, the two partner up for the winter to make some money hunting bounties before heading down south in search of Brunhilde. We're then treated to two brief montages. The first is a beautiful and cheery road trip kind of vibe, accompanied by Jim Croce's I Got a Name. Great song. This is the start of Django's visions of Brunhilde he'll have a few times throughout the rest of the movie. This montage ends with Django's first bounty, Smitty Bacall, which we'll come back to later. The next montage showcases Django developing his skills as a gunfighter, set to Riz Ortolani's theme for the spaghetti western Day of Anger. It's thrilling and loads of fun, and now Django is a bona fide badass. I mean, he already was, but at least this passage of time will make it so his absurd plot armor in the later Candyland shootout at least makes some sense, but as I said earlier, who cares? It's fun. With that, Django and Schultz, winner of bounty hunting, comes to a close, and the two head south to Greenville, Mississippi, the slave auction town where they can find the records of who now owns Broomhilda. I absolutely adore this Mississippi title card. One, because it's so oppressive, and it really signals that our heroes are deep in hostile territory, and two, because it's referencing Gone with the Wind, a film infamous for romanticizing the antebellum South. Every great filmmaker does this to a certain extent, but I don't think anyone comes close to Tarantino's ability to take audiences' familiarity with the established cinematic language and employ or recontextualize it into really effective meta-commentary, with casting, with music, and with camera work, like a hip-hop producer making samples. Many of Tarantino's critics argue that he just steals from better filmmakers, but in the words of Pablo Picasso, good artists copy, great artists steal. Schultz finds in the records that Broomhilda was purchased by one Calvin Candy, owner of Candyland, to which Django remarks that every slave has heard of Candyland. Candyland isn't the biggest or most lucrative plantation in Mississippi, but it is the most infamous, as Candy hosts Mandingo fights. Mandingo fighting being forced slave fights to the death. To infiltrate Candyland, Schultz comes up with a charade to get an audience with Candy. He'll play a big money buyer from Dusseldorf, interested in getting into the Mandingo fight game, and Django will play a Mandingo expert he's hired to help him do it. Now, we are finally introduced to Leonardo DiCaprio's Calvin Candy, and his performance here is just as phenomenal as you'd expect. When Tarantino was writing the character, he imagined Candy as a much older guy. It wasn't until Leo had gotten a hold of the script and showed interest in the part that Tarantino considered a whole new layer to the character.
Let me think about the piece now with a younger man, and let me kind of go through the paces just in my own mind to see, does that change anything? If he owns a property, a parcel of land that's 40 miles long or 65 miles long, okay, so he has all these slaves that work and live on the plantation. He also has all the ton of white workers that work there and work as overseers or doing the other things, you know, but they have their children and their wives and stuff. So you have literally a community living on this plantation, in these grounds. And for all intensive purposes, those plantation owners were kings. Now, but the Leo part about it, him being younger, that was interesting, is I had always thought of Calvin Candy as an evil king, an evil ruler. But then I started thinking about him playing the role, and I thought, well, rather than just the evil monarch, evil king, he's more like, he could be the petulant boy emperor, the King Louis XIV, the Caligula. Yeah, like his father's father and his father, they were the cotton men. But now he's not a cotton man. He's bored with it. He's grown up around it his whole life, and the farm kind of takes care of itself. So now he indulges in hedonistic vices and hedonistic hobbies to keep himself interested.
Candy is actually in the middle of hosting a fight when Django and Schultz meet him. And now would be a good time to get back to the film's portrayal of Mandingo fighting I mentioned at the start of the video. Essentially, Mandingo fighting is a myth, stemming from the 1975 blaxploitation film Mandingo, of which Tarantino is a fan. There is no reputable historical evidence of this human version of cockfighting ever being a thing, let alone an organized, almost gladiatorial Mandingo trade as portrayed in Django Unchained. Slaves were an investment, especially the biggest and strongest slaves as seen in this film. Economically, it made no sense to risk your greatest labor and business assets in fights to the death. Still, slaves were property and were naturally forced to perform all kinds of tasks beyond manual labor, like singing, dancing, and even boxing in very rare cases, so there's always the possibility of fights to the death having occurred, but like I said, there's no actual evidence for this. Now don't get me wrong, unimaginable evil and cruelty was inflicted upon the enslaved, and don't let any lost cause revisionism tell you otherwise. Torture, mutilation, castration, rape, and that only scratches the surface. The film does include some of these historically accurate aspects, like this one little boy with Big Daddy. He could just be light-skinned, but I always figured it was Tarantino showcasing a mixed-race child as the product of Big Daddy raping one of his slaves, which was unfortunately very commonplace. Just ask Thomas Jefferson. Hell, even George Washington wore the teeth pulled from slaves in his mouth. Yeah, grade school lied to you. Those are not wooden dentures. In the Greenville scene, Django and Schultz ride past slaves wearing restrictive headgear resembling some sort of medieval torture device, which was also commonplace. Finally, as seen in the film, comfort girls, essentially forced prostitution without any pay, so just slave rape, is also very accurate. So with all these very real horrors of slavery you can portray, to put a complete historical falsehood like Mandingo Fighting at the forefront of your film just further reiterates that Tarantino is making a spectacle of slavery as much as he is condemning it. Obviously, Django Unchained isn't a documentary, nor is it pretending to be, but I feel this is something worth clarifying. Narratively, however, this plot point is very effective. This sequence is disturbing. Schultz and Django offer Candy a potential $12,000 to purchase one of his fighters, who they'll select back at Candyland. With this, our heroes set off with Candy and his whole rotten entourage to the infamous plantation. I realize now I forgot to cover Schultz's opening acquisition of Django, along with the whole sequence in Daughtry, but even then, you can still tell a lot has happened in this movie so far, and we're not even halfway through. Thus, we get to my biggest critique of Django Unchained, the lopsided structure. The first hour of the film is excellent, with a really breezy pace. It's almost a series of vignettes, these self-contained sequences that each reach their own satisfying conclusion. It's very episodic. Think of the opening scene, followed by the scene with the sheriff and marshal in Texas, then Big Daddy's plantation. Traditionally, this is how Tarantino's films have been structured. Look at Pulp Fiction with its 3 interconnected stories, or Kill Bill and Inglourious Basterds with their chapters. The problem with Django Unchained is, however, it doesn't maintain this momentum. Almost the entire last 2 hours of a nearly 3-hour film are spent at Candyland, and while I do think the time spent here is great, I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the sprawling adventure of that first third. The last half hour feels especially drawn out. The film builds to a natural conclusion and climactic shootout, but then we spend another 30 minutes moseying on to the end. It's so weird because I do really enjoy all the scenes in that last half hour. Just goes to show how important pacing is. Even if the content is great, it can still feel like it overstays its welcome if not paced right. This was Tarantino's first film after the death of his longtime editor Sally Menke, who had worked on all of his films starting with Reservoir Dogs. His new editor, Fred Raskin, still does a great job, but I've always wondered if Menke would have been able to clean up the film's pace. Tarantino always cited her as his most important collaborator. The more contained latter half of the film does have its benefits. For one, we really get to sink our teeth into Tarantino's incredible characters. The dialogue and character work become the forefront of a film which, so far, has relied on fun genre set pieces. Along with that, everything at Candyland is a masterwork in tension, and much of the credit for that has to go to who I think is the film's best character, Stephen, played by Samuel L. Jackson. Stephen is the head house slave of Candyland and essentially runs the plantation while Candy's busy drinking and gambling, and boy does Stephen rule with an iron fist. This guy is diabolical, but he's also really funny.
Who this nigga on that nag?
It's Snowball.
That's who the hell you calling Snowball, horse boy? I'll snatch your black ass off that nag down here in the mud so fast make your head.
Stephen.
Stephen knows how to play the hand he's been dealt as a slave, and he relishes the power that comes from his position. He also seems to genuinely love and care for Calvin, his owner, as a son. And it's Stephen who recognizes Schultz and Django's charade and thwarts their plan.
And you must understand that historically, there were 2 types of slaves, the house Negro and the field Negro. Now, the house Negro, he lived in the house, next to his master, in the big house, either in the basement or up in the attic. He dressed pretty good, he ate pretty good, what the master left him. He loved his master. I say he loved his master better than the master loved himself. If the master said, we got a nice house here, you say, yeah, boss, we got a nice house here. Master's house caught on fire, the house Negro would be the one who'd run to put the blaze out. If the master got sick, he said, what's the matter, boss? We sick? We sick. You see, this is the thinking of the house Negro. Now, if another slave came up to him and said, let's run away, let's separate, let's get away from this cruel master, he said, why? What's better than what we got here? Run away, I'm not going anywhere. This is the house Negro.
After this, we get a scene where Candy confronts our heroes, where DiCaprio's acting chops are on full display. Candy brings out the preserved skull of one of the slaves who helped raise him, his father, and grandfather. He talks about how every morning, this slave, old Ben, would shave his father with a straight razor, and questions why Ben never once seized the opportunity to slit his father's throat. Candy explains this behavior by spouting phrenology, a racist 19th century pseudoscience that attributed the intelligence and personality traits of arbitrary racial and ethnic groups to skull shape. Obviously, this is a load of bullshit, but it was a key factor in justifying slavery, claiming that Africans were inherently less capable and more submissive. Justifications for slavery go beyond the pseudoscientific. It was also religious. Anyone familiar with religious texts, specifically Abrahamic religion, knows that slavery is not a subject that it shies away from. Earlier in the film, John Brittle is shown reciting scripture and even pinning pages from the Bible to himself before whipping a slave. This is all very important stuff to include because, while yes, these people are evil, they don't think of themselves as that way. These white aristocrats saw black slaves as essentially livestock, mindless sheep to which they have the moral justification to do whatever they want with. So, because Steven recognized that Django and Broomhilda knew each other, Schultz and Django are caught. I could be wrong, but I think the plan was to offer $12,000 to purchase a fighter, but first leave to consult a lawyer about the proper paperwork and then return with the money once that's been sorted out. But before that, Schultz would also pay an immediate $600 to leave with Broomhilda, and then just never return with the $12,000. That part's bullshit. So yes, they're lying to Candy, but they can still have a bill of sale and get Broomhilda her freedom legally instead of stealing her. Now that they're caught, however, Candy makes Schultz pay the $12,000 just for Broomhilda. After writing the check and signing the bill of sale, Candy orders Schultz to shake his hand. Schultz refuses and instead shoots Candy dead. He himself is then blasted with a shotgun and a total bloodbath ensues. The Candyland shootout is a classic, gratuitously violent Tarantino set piece. I love me some squibs and blood-soaked Western violence, and the James Brown and Tupac mashup playing during this scene is too damn good. But I find the justification for the shootout super contrived, in a narrative sense. I just don't believe that after all of this, Schultz would endanger the lives of Django and Broomhilda just for the sake of stroking his ego. I understand the principle of the matter, I wouldn't want to shake Candy's hand either, but damn it, Schultz, swallow your pride for just a second, and if you really need to, come back with Django for revenge later. I know Schultz's pride is kind of the entire point as to why he makes this decision, but where I have a problem is that, as far as he's concerned, he's damning Django and Broomhilda, and I just don't buy that he would ever do that. It's clear Tarantino wrote himself into a corner with Schultz stealing Django's thunder for most of the film and needed an excuse for Django to be the sole protagonist by the end, so he contrived this whole shake my hand thing to kill Schultz off. From a character standpoint though, it has been established that Schultz does enjoy displaying his intellectual and moral superiority over others. The way he telegraphs the whole situation in Daughtry just so he could slam dunk on these ignorant Southerners.
In other words, Marshal, you owe me $200.
Then there's the time where he's basically calling the Speck brothers stupid and it goes right over their head.
So, I wish to parley with you.
Speak English.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. It is a second language.
And finally, of course, the whole Alexandre Dumas thing with Candy. In the end, there is no way Schultz could live with this evil dumbass getting the best of him. I guess. I don't know. I still don't buy it. Django surrenders, and rather than being killed or tortured, Steven and the rest of Candy's entourage come up with a fate worse than death, and decide to sell him to the LaQuitt & Dickey Mining Company, a company particularly cruel to its slaves. While being transported, Django tells the LaQuitt & Dickey employees that he's not a slave, he's a bounty hunter, and uses the Smitty Bacall handbill from earlier to fabricate a story about him being at Candyland to hunt Bacall and the whole thing going awry. He offers to split the money with the employees if they give him a horse and gun and they all go back to claim the bounty, but once they fall for it, Django just kills all of them, and then frees the slaves that were being transported with him. I love this look that the one slave gives him as he rides back to Candyland, especially because when Django was playing the evil slaver role earlier, he was being extra mean to this guy. So it all comes full circle and he respects him now. Django saves Broomhilda from Candy's slave catchers, along with getting his get back for the killing of the slave D'Artagnan earlier. Then he returns to Candyland and has a final standoff with Steven, freeing the slaves and killing the whites.
I said tell Miss Laura goodbye.
Bye, Miss Laura.
We also get my favorite line exchange in the whole movie.
I count 6 shots, nigga.
I count 2 guns, nigga.
Django rigs the house with explosives and destroys Candyland, riding off into the sunset, or I guess moonlight, with his wife. And thus, Django Unchained comes to a close. I love this movie, and I think it cemented itself as one of the all-time great modern westerns. A lot of 21st century westerns fall prey to the baggage that comes with the genre and feel the need to be a grounded and prestige deconstructive neo-western, so it's nice to get a big-budget spectacle that has no shame about its pulpy genre roots. Don't get it twisted though, Django Unchained isn't just dumb fun. There is a lot of passion, artistry, and technical skill on display. The film is a must-watch. Alright, let's close off this analysis, like always, with some fun facts I stumbled upon during my research for this video. Jonah Hill, who makes a cameo appearance alongside Big Daddy as part of the lynch mob, originally had a much bigger part. He would have played a character named Scotty Harmony, the dim-witted son of Southern slavers who purchased Broomhilda for Scotty to help make him a man. He would lose Broomhilda to Calvin Candy in a poker game, and after challenging Candy to a duel, would be shot and killed. This whole segment was cut. This is pretty common knowledge at this point, but Tarantino originally wrote the part of Django with Will Smith in mind, who turned down the role. Idris Elba, Chris Tucker, Terrence Howard, and Tyrese Gibson were also considered for the part. When Calvin Candy smashes his fist on the dinner table, DiCaprio accidentally crushed a glass which cut open his hand. Staying in character, he finished the take, and this was the take that Tarantino used in the final film. DiCaprio's hand was bandaged, and after the wound was treated, he came up with the idea of smearing the blood onto Broomhilda's face, which makes it into the movie. Jamie Foxx, a Texas native, used his own horse, Cheetah, for the film. He got the horse 4 years earlier as a birthday present. After seeing the film, legendary composer Ennio Morricone claimed that he would never collaborate with Quentin Tarantino again, saying that Tarantino places music in his films without coherence and never gives them enough time to play out. However, Morricone would relent and collaborate with Tarantino again for his next film, The Hateful Eight, which earned Morricone his first Oscar. While training for the film, Christoph Waltz was thrown off his horse and broke his pelvis. Jamie Foxx gave him a gift to make him feel better about riding a horse, a saddle with a seatbelt. Quentin Tarantino revealed at Comic-Con that Django and Broomhilda are meant to be the great-great-great-grandparents of the character John Shaft from the Shaft films. This is referenced in Broomhilda's full name, Broomhilda von Shaft. Finally, Franco Nero, the Italian actor who played the original Django in the 1966 film, makes a cameo as a slaver in the Mandingo fight with Candy. When he meets Django at the bar, he asks Django his name and how to spell it. Django spells it out and tells him the D is silent, to which Nero responds, "I know." It's a great meta moment, but this scene always reminds me of this really funny Cat Williams clip.
I'm trying to figure out how you had a silent letter before could read. Now, listen to what I just said. How could you have a silent letter before black people could read?
How could you have a silent letter before?
He says, my name is Django. The J is silent.
The D is silent. Django, yeah.
You're not even supposed to be able to...
Alright, y'all. That pretty much wraps up what I have to say about Django Unchained. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know what Western I should cover next.